All right, here we are sitting in the hangar. We made it just in time, as you guys can see. What's up, guys? It's Justin and I. We're here at the drome. We just mowed all this grass. It was pretty long.
About 4 acres.
Yeah, about 4 acres.
And wet.
So we're waiting for Andrew. Andrew's bringing a fleet biplane through, going up to Chicago, and we're going to go out and do a video, so it should be fun. Hope you guys enjoy this. We have some other friends showing up. It's going to be a good evening for us. So. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, good people. Seemed like a long day. It's like 5 hours of flying, but I started at 9:15 and it's 5 o'clock. And it's loud. 8 hours on it since the annual. Couldn't believe it. We're here at the Dewey drome this morning, May 26th, I think, something like that. I think it's my birthday soon, but anyways, we're here with this 1929 Fleet Model 2. It's a neat airplane. It's very representative of the 1929 to early 1930s era. These were one of the most popular airplanes in America back in that time period. The Travelers, the Wacos, they were a little bit bigger, but for a two-seat, a little bit smaller airplane, a little bit less horsepower, fleets were probably the most common in this range, 100 to 150 horsepower. This particular airplane was built in 1929, August 1929. Consolidated Fleet Aircraft Company was a division of Consolidated. Reuben Fleet was a very well-known aviation pioneer back in the 20s, aviation personality, and he founded Consolidated Aircraft. They built trainers for the military, for the Army and for the Navy. Consolidated Husky, the PTE-3 and NY-2 were some of the designations. They looked very similar to this, but they were quite a bit bigger, probably 15% bigger, much bigger engines, Wright Whirlwind 220 horsepower engines. And they decided to try for the civil market, and they built a smaller version called the Husky Junior, which ended up becoming the Fleet. And so they formed the Fleet Aircraft Division of Consolidated in Buffalo, New York, around 1928 or so, to build these airplanes, and they were very successful. Consolidated had a big engineering department. It's a very well-engineered airplane, kind of advanced in that way compared to a lot of its contemporaries. But they built several hundred. They built, I think, 200 of these Model 2s and another couple hundred probably of the various other models. In the late 30s, Fleet Aircraft kind of separated from Consolidated. Consolidated moved to San Diego, to the West Coast, and got into building flying boats, the Catalina flying boat and patrol flying boats and bombers and stuff. They built the B-24 Liberator in World War II. But Fleet separated off, stayed in Buffalo, New York. Eventually, the Canadians became interested in the design, and the Fleet factory, I think, moved to Fort Erie in Ontario, and they built another 400 up there in World War II for trainers, the Fleet 16B. So they're the most common type of surviving fleet. But these Model 2s and then the Model 7, which had a slightly upgraded engine, are still fairly common. I wouldn't be surprised if there's 30 or 40 of them flying around the country at this point. As I say, it's a two-seat, kind of a light airplane. This is a 125 horsepower Kinner engine, 5-cylinder Kinner engine. Originally would have had the 100 horsepower Kinner, which is quite a bit less reliable. I'm happy this one has the 125 on it, and a lot of them have been upgraded to the 125. But it's a 5-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine. As I said, they're fairly reliable. I like to keep an eye on these cylinder head studs. The cylinder heads bolt onto the barrels, and I've had some of these strip out. I used to have a fleet just like this, and I've had some of these strip out. So that's one of the things I always look for on pre-flight, is make sure all these nuts are there anyway. Take a close look at it. But other than that, it's a pretty good engine. It has a reputation for kind of being a thumper. It makes a unique noise. You can hear a Kinner coming from miles away, and everybody knows it's a Kinner. So it has that kind of reputation. We've been doing our pre-flight. One of the things, of course, on a radial engine is you pull it through, make sure there's no oil that's collected in the lower cylinders. Sometimes the oil will drain from the crankcase down into the lower cylinders. So that's standard procedure. Everything's off, the magneto's off, mixture's lean, throttle's back, and all that stuff. One of the things you'll notice when you pull it through is the click of the impulse mags. That loud clicking, that's another kind of a Kinner characteristic. Most of the radials don't have impulse mags like that. But the Kinner does, and it's an extra spring-loaded snap thing on the magnetos to help in starting, and it makes it one of the easier to start radial engines. Most radial engines, you have to pull them as hard as you can, try to get the prop going as fast as possible. This, you can literally walk it through just like I just was, and when that magneto clicks, that impulse clicks, it'll start right up. So it's one of the easier engines to start if you're hand propping. That's one of the good things. Landing gear's pretty tough. It has this unique yoke here, where the landing gear struts it's kind of cross. That's kind of cool. I have seen that on a couple of airplanes, but that's pretty rare. And there's oleo struts then at the bottom of the landing gear V's. This particular airplane has a kind of an interesting history as far as the vintage airplane movement. 431 Kilo is the registration number. It was in Wisconsin in the 1950s and 60s, and it went to a lot of the early fly-ins, the early EAA fly-ins during the 50s and 60s, the early Antique Airplane Association fly-ins in Ottumwa, Iowa, back in the 50s and 60s, and it was owned by some notable people. Buck Hilbert was one of the owners, who was very well known in the EAA circles. Art Knowles in Texas owned it for a while, and he was another well-known EAAer. Probably the most famous owner of this airplane was Richard Bach, who wrote the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and he used it for barnstorming. He'd go land on hayfields and stuff and take people for rides in it, and that's his logo on the side. The Great American Flying Circus is the logo of Richard Bach. So he was probably the best known owner of it. Eventually it went through a couple more owners. It ended up with a guy named Stan Swiker in Maryland, and he flew it for a while, and then the engine quit, and I can't remember why the engine stopped, but he didn't have a good landing field underneath him, and ended up going upside down and damaging the wings and stuff. So he completely restored it the way it is now, and did a fantastic job on it. It's the nicest fleet I've ever seen, and it's as nice on the inside. If you take off the inspection covers and look inside, it's as nice on the inside as it is on the outside. So Stan restored it around 2012 and flew it for several years. He unfortunately passed away, and then it's gone through a couple of other owners and recently sold to a man in Wisconsin, and that's what we're in the middle of the trip now from Virginia to Wisconsin. So stopped at the Dewey Drome overnight and headed for Wisconsin. Stan was an engineer at Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. A friend of his was an astronaut, and so he persuaded this person somehow to take the throttle knob that's in the rear cockpit, the little round throttle knob on the top of the throttle, on the space shuttle for a mission. And you'll see there's a little pin in there that says STS, whatever the mission number was, but there's a certificate in the paperwork that says this throttle knob went to 160 miles altitude and traveled 20,000 miles, whatever the numbers are. But that's kind of an interesting thing, that the throttle knob has been to outer space. So it's a good flying airplane. The competition for this was the Great Lakes biplane. There was always a big competition between Fleet and Great Lakes. And Great Lakes, I think, is actually a more capable airplane. The Fleet, again, it's a well-engineered airplane. It's very capable. A man named Paul Mantz was famous for flying a Fleet and doing 46 outside loops in a row in a Fleet like this. There was a guy named Tex Rankin that flew a Great Lakes, and he would do 32, and then Paul would do 40. You know, they had a kind of a competition to show which airplane was better and stronger. But an outside loop, of course, a normal loop, when you're flying level, you pull up and you go around so the pilot is on the inside of the loop. An outside loop, when you're flying level, you push forward and go down like this and then around, so the pilot is on the outside and the centrifugal force is trying to throw him out of the airplane, and it's a much harder maneuver to do than a normal loop. But Paul Mantz did 46 outside loops in a row over Palo Alto, California back in 1930. So Paul Mantz was Mr. Fleet kind of back in the 30s. Everybody knew him. And there was a woman named Bernadine King who used to have a red, white, and blue on and do air shows, and she had her name written on the side of the fuselage upside down, because she'd fly by upside down and then her name would be right side up. So that was another kind of a well-known Fleet personality back in the 30s. But it goes about 85 miles an hour, burns about 8 gallons of gas an hour. The fuel tank holds, I think, 23.5 gallons, so almost 3 hours of fuel. And it's more than I can sit in it. It's made for somebody about 6 inches shorter than me, and my feet are back and my knees are up, and it's not the most comfortable airplane I've ever flown. But of course, back in 1929, the average person fit pretty well in it. But it flies pretty nice. It lands pretty easy. It was a good training airplane. There's full dual controls pretty much in both cockpits, and it was a good training airplane. One interesting thing on the tail, you'll see on the tail, when they first came out with the Fleet, and Fleets in general have always had a little bit of a tail heaviness problem, and they had problems. They wouldn't come out of a spin. Get them in a spin and they wouldn't come out of a spin. And there was a couple things, you know, facets to the story. When the Fleets were first built, the horizontal stabilizer here was just a flat plate, and which most horizontal stabilizers are. But when they had the problems with the tail heaviness, the way they fixed it was to add an airfoil, and you can see how it's curved on the top. It's flat on the bottom and curved on the top like a wing, and so it's basically a small wing rather than just a stabilizer like the tail of an arrow. And so that adds lift at the back and helps with the tail heaviness thing. The problem was that that won't help you if you're in a spin and the airplane is stalled and it's spinning. That's not going to help you. And so one of the things they did, this is a rare Fleet in the sense that it has the original, the fin, the vertical fin, and the rudder are the original ones on there, the original size. Later airplanes, they made this fin much bigger. It came all the way up to basically the front here. They basically doubled or more than doubled the size of it to help you get out of a spin. It made you get out of a spin. And then they made the rudder bigger, actually, too. There was a service bulletin to make the rudder bigger, and it said it had to be so many square feet, and people kind of did whatever they wanted as far as stretching the rudder out and making it bigger. So you'll see 10 different Fleets with 10 different shaped rudders, but they're all bigger than this. So this is, it's a rare one. So we don't do aerobatics in it because we don't want to inadvertently get in a spin. But it's plenty strong enough, but that's kind of a historical footnote about it, and a little something that affects the way that we operate the airplane. But that's an interesting thing, this lifting tail. The whole stabilizer goes up and down. There's a jack screw down in the fuselage, and there's a cable on the left side of the cockpit, and you just grab that cable and either pull it backward or forward, and it runs a little jack screw here, and the whole front of the back of the stabilizer, or the front of the stabilizer, goes up and down. So that's how they do the longitudinal trim. The Great American Flying Circus, this is the logo that Richard Bach had on the airplane. And Bach was a former Air Force pilot. He flew jets in the Air Force, I think, in the 50s. And then was kind of a creative genius or a literary genius. He wrote the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which was a huge hit back in I think it was in the 60s that Jonathan Livingston Seagull came out. And then he wrote a number of books about flying biplanes. He loved flying biplanes. He wanted to be a barnstormer like the old-fashioned barnstormers. He would go out and fly around the Midwest and just land in a farmer's field and try to make money selling biplane rides. And then he wrote books about them that are fantastic books. He's very well known in the aviation community for his aviation books, Nothing by Chance and Illusions. There's 4 or 5 of his books that very good books and very well known in the aviation community. But he owned this airplane, I think, in the 70s. This was his logo. The 1922 date is kind of, I think, just a made-up date, just to kind of say it's a barnstorming airplane. But when Stan Swiker restored the airplane, he put the logo back on, kind of a tribute to Richard Bach. All right, here in the cockpit, there's some original stuff. These 3 instruments are not original. That's the oil temperature, oil pressure, look like original gauges. That's certainly an old-time tachometer. Radio obviously is new. The fuel valve is over here. It's in both cockpits. That's on. You turn it down, basically 90 degrees is off. So the fuel is on. Control stick. Normal control stick in the middle, and then pedals up on either side of the front seat. The throttle is over on the left sidewall here with the famous throttle knob that went to outer space. Mag switch, mixture. basic stuff. The trim cables, as I say, are on the left side over here, where you just grab the hold of the cable and pull the top one. If you pull it back, you go nose up. If you pull it forward, you get nose down. So it's pretty simple. This is a 125 horsepower Kinner B5 engine. B5R, I guess, rear exhaust. I think it's, I'm not sure the cubic inches, I think it's 400 and some cubic inches, I believe. But it's typical early engine where there's no oil flow to the tops of the cylinders where the valves and stuff are, so you have to grease them by hand. It says, I think it's every 10 hours or before every important flight. So, whoops, take that off. So this is an important flight. Give it a few shots here. That should do. All right, so that's the 1929 fleet. Hope you enjoyed our little walk around. We've got feels like a tailwind, so I'm trying to get to Wisconsin today. It's I think about 360 miles. So I'll probably stop 3 times. I keep to about an hour and 15-minute legs just for the sake of my backside. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the walk around, and stay tuned. Like the YouTube channel and give us a thumbs up and subscribe and all that stuff. And we'll talk to you soon. Clear prop.
All right, you guys can see Andrew just showed up in the fleet. Looks like we got some storms coming from the west here, and we're not quite sure if it's going to hit here or not. And since my hangar's kind of cluttered up, I'm going to pull some stuff out of the hangar, take this trailer out, and then make some room for the fleet and tie down the Champ. Should be tying down Peter's ultralight, but it'll blow away. So